Agenda item 3 is consideration of a current petition. The next item of business is an evidence session with the Scottish Government as part of the committee's consideration of petition PE1458 by Peter Chirby on a register of interest for members of Scotland's judiciary. Members have a note by the clerk and the submissions. I'd also like to mention that though nothing has been received from the Judicial Complaints Reviewer, the petitioner notified the clerk that JCR's annual report to 31st of August, which covers the tenure of the previous officeholder, Mo Ali, was published on Friday, so some members may already have received that. Could I welcome Paul Wheelhouse, who's the Member for Community Safety and Legal Affairs, and his officials, who's Kate McCorkadale and Catherine Hodgson from the Scottish Government Civil Law and Legal Systems Division. You're very welcome. Thank you very much for coming along. And could I invite the Minister to make a brief opening statement, approximately 5 minutes, after which we'll move to questions. Mr Wheelhouse.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for inviting me today. I welcome this further consideration of the issues around a register of interests for the judiciary, in particular the sufficiency of the existing safeguards. The Scottish Government takes the view that it is not necessary to establish a formal register of judicial interests. That is because, as my predecessor Rosanna Cunningham has stated, the Scottish Government considers that the safeguards that are currently in place are sufficient to ensure the impartiality of the judiciary in Scotland. There's no evidence to date that safeguards have failed. In short, the important safeguards are the judicial oath taken by all judicial office holders before they sit on the bench, which requires judges to do right to all manner of people without fear or favour, affection or ill will. The Statement of Principles of Judicial Ethics, which states at Principle 5 that all judicial office holders have a general duty to act impartially. In particular, it notes, plainly it is not acceptable for a judge to adjudicate upon any matter in which he or she or any members of his or her family has a pecuniary interest. The third thing is the Judiciary and Courts Scotland Act 2008, which contains provisions to regulate and investigate the conduct of judicial office holders. Under Section 28, the Lord President has a power to make rules for the investigation of, and I quote, any matter concerning the conduct of judicial office holders, unquote. The complaints about the Judiciary Scotland rules came into force in 2011 and were updated in 2013. The Lord President also consulted on the adequacy of the rules in autumn 2013. The formal Judicial Complaints Reviewer contributed to this consultation, and I understand that the new rules, together with accompanying guidance, will be published early in 2015. The new rules will simplify the complaints process for all concerned and clarify what can be properly investigated. In addition, as you're aware, from 1st of April 2014, the Scottish Court Service has set up a public register of judicial recusals. This register was set up following the former JCR's call for a greater transparency and accountability and the informal meeting between yourself, Convener, the Deputy Convener, Chick Brodie at the time, and Lord President. This register sets out the reason why a member of the judiciary has recused him or herself from hearing a case, and this is a welcome addition to the safeguards I've already mentioned. With regard to the complaint system, I'm aware of the criticisms made in the former JCR's annual report published last week. I would like to acknowledge the positive influence that the former JCR has had in relation to the handling of complaints about judicial conduct during her time in office, and this has contributed to the improvements that are being made to the complaint system. It is, of course, of vital importance that judges are seen to be both independent and impartial. They must be free from prejudice by association or relationship with a party to a litigation. They must be able to demonstrate impartiality by having no vested interest, such as a pecuniary interest or indeed a familial interest that could affect them in exercising their judicial functions. Setting up a register of judicial interests would be a matter for the Lord President as head of the judiciary in Scotland. The Lord President takes the view that a register of pecuniary interest for the judiciary is not needed, and that a judge has a greater duty of disclosure than a register of financial interests itself could address. The Statement of Principles of Judicial Ethics states that a judge's disclosure duties extend to material relationships, and the new register of recusals addresses this issue. It's also important to bear in mind the potential downsides of establishing a register of judicial interests. The Lord President said in his written evidence to the committee that it's possible that, and I quote, information held in a register of judicial interests could be abused. If publicly criticised or attacked, the judicial office holder cannot publicly defend himself or herself, unlike a politician. The establishment of such a register therefore may have the unintended consequences of eroding public confidence in the judiciary, unquote. The Lord President has provided further information about the new register of recusals in his letter to the committee of 21st of November, and this records that all but 2 judicial recusals were on a voluntary basis. There is no record of a case where a judge or sheriff who has an interest that would justify recusal has had to recuse him or herself when a party raised the matter. There is therefore no evidence to demonstrate that the existing system of recusals is not working. I would like to acknowledge the work, finally, Convener, that the committee has done in taking forward the issues raised by this petition. As the convener, as acknowledged in the Chamber debate, the New Zealand Bill was ultimately withdrawn on the basis that agreement was reached to improve the rules on recusals and conflicts of interest. We have similarly had the opportunity for open discussion of these issues, and improvements have already been made in Scotland, such as the introduction of the Public Register of Judicial Recusals that I referred to earlier. Improvements to the complaints rules are about to be introduced, and the Scottish Government's position is that a formal register of judicial interest is not practical nor necessary, and I'm now happy to take questions, Convener.
Thank you, Minister. Why should the judiciary be treated any differently from other holders of public office, such as ministers, MSPs or MPs?
Well, I think the point, Convener, I just referred to in my opening remarks that was made by the Lord President himself in his letter of the 21st of November, I think is pertinent here. I certainly recognise that as politicians we have a duty to be accountable to the public that elect us and to be able to demonstrate that we do not have any conflict of interest. The position of the judiciary is somewhat different. As the Lord President has outlined, they don't have the ability to answer for themselves if they are criticised or attacked for their interests, and therefore they are vulnerable in that sense. There's also the concern that in some respects, particularly if there was any register of property details or issues which might cause security concerns for individuals or their families, that potentially opened them up to threats of intimidation. I just put it in the context of my previous role where I was aware of SEPA officials who were being stalked, harassed on social media. Their families were being stalked and harassed on social media, and they were being physically and verbally threatened on a regular basis in dealing with some serious individuals involved with organised crime, it has been alleged. So therefore, I've seen it in a previous context that officials can be intimidated or tempted to be intimidated by those who have ill intent. And so therefore, the more that we protect the privacy of aspects which could give security concerns to the judiciary, that will be better in terms of ensuring that we have no attempt to in any way influence the decision of a judge.
How do you respond to the arguments from the petitioner and the previous JCR that the current system does not provide individuals with sufficient protection from judicial bias?
Well, clearly, I'm aware that of the concerns. I mean, I want to recognise the genuine concerns that have been raised by members of the public, including Mr Cherby and indeed committee members during the debate on the 9th of October, and the concern to ensure that not that anyone is particularly pointed the finger of blame at any particular judge, I stress, but that there is at least a perception that the judicial system in Scotland is above reproach and there is no danger of bias in terms of the decision-making process. Clearly, the concern that has been expressed has been addressed in a number of respects. We have the JCR position and the ability to lodge a complaint against the judiciary if it comes to light that there has been any conflict of interest which has not been disclosed, and therefore there's a mechanism by which people can raise a complaint and that can be taken forward by the JCR. Also, the recusals process itself, where to date we have, as I said in my opening remarks, no evidence to suggest that someone has been forced to recuse themselves by someone raising a conflict of interest. In every case so far, the judge concerned has brought forward their own issues and therefore recused themselves, or has, in the case of two cases that I'm aware of, notably the most latterly Judge Cowan, who brought forward the issue that being a member of the RSPB might be perceived as a conflict, and put that to both parties in the court case, and they were given the option as to whether to allow her to continue in her role or whether she should recuse herself, and ultimately the defendant in that case asked for her to recuse herself. So that the process does seem to work, and therefore we have no evidence to suggest that, to date at least, that there is any such bias that has been identified in any court case.
But how will the parties know there's a conflict if there's not a register of interest? They're not psychic.
I take the point, and I'm aware that clearly these are concerns that I will take forward when I meet for the first time. I've not yet met Lord Gill, or indeed the new JCR, Gillian Thompson, OBE. I will raise these issues when I meet with them in the context of wider discussions and see if they have any thoughts themselves. But I think the principle here is about the register. If there was a public register, and I note again for the record that New Zealand, which was the if you like, the original prompt for this case coming forward before the Scottish Parliament, has decided itself to drop the proposal for a public register and to strengthen its recusal process and its complaints procedure, which are two systems which are already in place in Scotland, and in the case of the complaints procedure is currently being updated by the Lord President. That these systems are being deployed in New Zealand as well, rather than a public register. There are concerns about the ability to ensure that there is no undue influence or harassment of figures within the judiciary as a result of information they present. And in any case, the register can never be completely complete, if I can be mixing my terms there very badly, in that it's very difficult for a judge to anticipate the full extent of cases that might come before them, and therefore they could potentially have to declare absolutely everything in terms of every person they know, every organisation they're a member of, every financial interest they have, and that may be entirely unnecessary given the caseload that comes before them.
Argument is true for ministers. You're not expected to declare every single aspect. There's a laid-down procedure for what you as an individual minister and I as an individual member has to lay down. No one's asking us to be psychic. We need to make sure we follow the rules that are laid down. If it's good enough for us, why is it not good enough for judges?
Well, I think, if I may, I take the point entirely, Convener, and I think it's entirely appropriate that we do declare that information as ministers and MSPs and MPs, indeed. We have the opportunity, albeit sometimes it doesn't feel that way in terms of the media, to be able to answer for our actions and to be able to get our point across in a way that a judge may not be able to do so. Politicians can answer for ourselves. We are usually pretty robust in when we do so. It is more difficult for a member of the judiciary, and I think we have to recognise that as a parliament. They are in a different position and unable to answer for themselves in the way that we would.
I must say I haven't noticed that judges are slow to come forward in the Sunday Mail recently, but that's our leader. Can start with David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Minister. In the letter submitted to committee on the 21st of November by a Lord President, the Judiciary Scotland rules, there's new guidance and rules going to be published early in 2015. Does the Minister think they will go some way to addressing the concerns raised by a petitioner?
It's a very good point, Deputy Convener. We have, and congratulations, by the way, on your election, Deputy Convener. We clearly will have to leave the detail of this to Lord President to bring forward his response to the issues that have been raised by the JCR in the past and also in the most recent report. And obviously, these are issues that I will look to discuss with the Lord President when I do meet Lord Gill in due course. But in terms of the detail that is in there, I will shortly bring in Kay McCorkadale, if I may, and just to discuss what detail we're aware of. But I have every confidence the Lord President has listened to the criticisms. There's already been some moves that have been made to try and address some of the concerns that have been raised both by the committee and, importantly, the JCR, the former JCR, Moyali, in terms of her concerns about complaints procedure, and clearly reflecting on the report, which raises some concerns about specific cases, to make sure that the complaints procedure addresses all those. I will be looking to, as the Minister, to see that that those procedural weaknesses that have been identified have been addressed in due course. But if I can maybe bring in Kay McCorkadale, Convener, with your permission.
I must say the Scottish Government's in exactly the same position as the Minister here, in that we've not seen the draft rules. We know there's been a consultation, and we know that the Judicial Complaints Reviewer fed into that consultation, and we've every anticipation that her concerns will have been addressed. But we will meet with the Lord President's private office, and I'm sure they will let us see the rules when they're in a position to share them with us.
Thank you. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. May I welcome you to your new role as the Minister for Community Safety and Legal Affairs. Minister, you've indicated and laid out quite clearly your defence for not having a register. The petition that's before this committee is one that called for a register to ensure that the public could have confidence in the judiciary in Scotland. There was an article earlier this year in The Guardian, which highlighted problems that were being identified in England and Wales about who judges the judges. So the question I would like to ask you, Minister, is, are you 100% confident that every judge and every sheriff will recuse themselves when there is an interest that they may have in the issue before them when they're in the bench? Because one of the problems we have is, and one of the issues raised by the petitioner, is that they feel that we don't have on public record information to tell us whether or not a sheriff or a judge has an interest or, on the issue before them, or even the individuals before them, that it may be come out at a later date and it may be seen as unfair by the person who is appearing in court, that they feel they've been unfairly treated and unfairly judged in those circumstances.
Well, there are clearly some very, very significant issues there that have been raised by John Wilson. First of all, thank you for your welcome, Mr. Wilson. And in terms of the, can I give 100% guarantee that every judge will always recuse themselves appropriately, I think it would be unreasonable for me to say that I can, in the sense that, you know, I can't be 100% certain every MSP or every MP or every other public person, celebrity, whoever, will always declare their interests. But am I confident that the system in place has procedures there to address that, or will do in the course of the reforms to the complaints procedure? I believe so. It's worth stating that, you know, there's a potential that, to pick up the point about the confidence, the public confidence in the judiciary is extremely important. I think that's, Mr. Wilson has hit the nail on the head there in terms of the rationale behind the whole debate that we are having, is to deliver confidence in the judiciary and ensure that is maintained. We were trying to search as to whether any surveys that define this one way or the other, and we haven't been able to pick up a survey to date, convener. But you know, there are certainly, from a personal perspective, I don't have any sense that there is a widespread concern about the judiciary and a lack of confidence in the judiciary. There may be, from time to time, disagreements over the outcome of particular cases, and that's entirely understandable, where you have two parties to a dispute, both a defendant and a prosecutor. But there is not the impression I have that there is a widespread concern about the judiciary. So how do we make sure that is maintained and there is never a concern about the ability of the judiciary to be unbiased? And we need to have in place robust systems for recusals, which I think we are developing, and it seems to be the case that, to my mind at least, that the judiciary are using the recusal process appropriately. We have a complaints procedure that is perfect, apparently not, and I recognise the points that have been made by the JCR in her report. I'm confident the Lord President will reflect on those and reform the process. Are there sanctions for those who fail to recuse themselves? Yes, there are. And if judicial holders, office holders, do breach those rules and found that a complaint is made, potentially it might be grounds for an appeal if it's an original case that people feel that the judge should not have taken that case. That could be a legitimate grounds for appeal, and obviously that will depend on a case-for-case basis. But the Lord President may give the judicial office holder formal advice about what they've done, obviously a formal warning or indeed a reprimand, which would be damaging to their reputation. So there are measures in place to address the situation should they arise. But I do recognise the concern about the fact that the recusal process, if you like, is to some extent shrouded in privacy because it is within the judiciary itself and not open to public scrutiny. And as I say, I will look to discuss the degree to which the Lord President and the new JCR, Gillian Thompson, have any suggestions as to how that might be addressed in future.
Thank you, Minister. But you are aware that recusals are voluntary, and while I welcome the Lord President's submission in relation to the number of recusals, and you mentioned yourself Judge Cowan's decision to recuse herself in a case that she was hearing in terms of wildlife issues, the issue is that it's still voluntary. And how a member of the public or someone appearing before the bench is aware that a judge or a sheriff may have a particular interest in the issue they're hearing may come out after the case and are beyond the appeal process time, because the appeal process time is very limited in terms of it's a 3-month appeal process as I understand it. So it may be a matter of 12 months, 2 years down the road that it may come out that a judge or a sheriff had a particular vested interest in a case that they were hearing. So how does that provide confidence in the judiciary system that we have in Scotland if people feel that judges, and you said it yourself, shrouded in secrecy in terms of how the complaints process is dealt with? So how do we ensure the public have more confidence that when they are appearing in court, they will be dealt with without fear or favour in relation to the case that's being heard before a sheriff or a judge?
Well, I certainly note the points that Mr Wilson has made. Just identified that there are 3 possible scenarios in terms of recusal. The 2 that have been used so far where someone voluntarily recuses themselves. So they identify themselves as a risk, and they decide for themselves that it's such a significant issue that they voluntarily recuse themselves from taking forward that case. The second scenario is where there's an element of perception about it, perhaps that they don't believe it's going to materially impact on their decision, but they offer that to both sides in the court case and leave it to them to decide whether they feel the member of the judiciary should recuse himself, and that's happened twice to my knowledge, and so therefore that has worked. The third scenario would be potentially where a judge or sheriff who has an interest that would justify recusal says nothing about it, and thereafter has to recuse himself or herself when a party raises the matter. And I appreciate this is during the court case. We have no record of any instance of this happening so far. So from the point of view of, and I've no information provided me to this date, convener, that there has been a conflict of interest that has not been identified during the court case and has only been revealed thereafter. Now, I appreciate the recusal process is relatively new, so we can't guarantee it's never happened in the past. But the recusal process, now that it's up and running, and perhaps we've not put enough emphasis on it as well, the oath as well that the judiciary have to take is quite onerous and is quite clear in terms of the requirements of the judiciary in terms of to assess the potential conflicts of interest and under sort of ethical guidance. Sure.
Question. I mean, the big issue I've been pushing, I think my colleagues have as well, is that you're assuming that those appearing before a judge have got some form of psychic powers here. How are they going to know that there's a conflict? If there's not a register, they're not going to be aware of this. Until Chick Brodie and myself met the Lord President, and I'll be fair to the Lord President here, there wasn't a system of recording recusals. That was a point we made to the Lord President, and in fairness, he agreed to that. That only came into force in April. So it's only since then that you've been able to assess whether judges have recused or not. Before that, it was a complete mystery. Even recusals were a mystery. Mm-hmm. So the point I'm making to you is you're making out that this is very much, everything's done in fairness and it's all above board. I mean, the ordinary person appearing before a judge will not have a clue whether there's any conflict in the judge appearing before him. And that's the key point. We are wanting, or the petitioner is wanting, a system that's similar to what other public officials have. And the only real argument you've got is that the judges can't defend themselves. Well, I'm sorry, I don't think that's a very strong argument, frankly.
If I can say so, Convener, that's a misrepresentation of what I said earlier on. I did not say that's the only grounds. I think there are serious concerns about potential influence on the judiciary of revealing their interests in a public register. It would open them up to potentially hostile and aggressive press action, which might themselves apply pressure on them to come down a particular way in terms of their adjudication. And it may, in some cases, as I said earlier on, if revealing property interests or of anything, it might give away an address, a physical address. It could put them physically at risk of threats, as in relation to I've experienced in terms of colleagues I work with within the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency who have been threatened by those who are involved in criminal activity. So I think we have to be very careful what we wish for here. I totally take on board your points, Convener, about the need for transparency in the sense that people have to understand that that the judicial system is fair, above board and unbiased, and that is entirely right that the committee has taken a very strong interest in that. I'm merely appealing to the committee to think about the potential consequences of having a public-facing register that could expose members of the judiciary to undue influence from outside the court process and put them at risk, or their families at risk, in doing so. We have to recognise that many members of the judiciary are dealing with extremely sensitive and often extremely violent people in the context of their work, and it is different from politicians. It is important they don't have the right to defend themselves, and I raised that point. That's a fair point for the convener to have raised, but I do have a concern more widely about the risk that puts to the judiciary too.
Sorry, I'm a bit conscious of time. I want to bring Kenny McCaskill and I want to come back to John Wilson, but just before we leave that point, nobody in this committee wants to put judges at any security concerns. Ministers and MSPs don't reveal their home addresses. We would obviously have a basic procedure that follows that. So also, we would not want you to misrepresent what I'm suggesting. We would obviously have a registrar that would respect the security concerns of judges. To do otherwise would be very strange policy indeed. Ken McCaskill and then John Wilson.
Public interest. The jurisdiction that does have a register is the United States. I have to say, I'm only going by apocryphal tales, but I've seen potential candidates for the Supreme Court, frankly, probably dissuaded, if not rejected, by House committees where they have been, frankly, pilloried. It's where the balance is struck. And I just wondered if there was any jurisprudential evidence from the United States as to whether it has been enhanced or whether the public opprobrium wreaked upon many people who were potential nominees for the Supreme Court just dissuaded people from going into that theatre at all.
Well, that's an important point that Mr McCaskill raises. In his submission 23rd of October, the petitioner drew attention to the position in relation to Register of Interest in America, and we have the origins of the US, the United States itself as a country explains to some degree the formal regulation of government ethics. There has been sort of a great attention on this since the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. And the Ethics in Government Act in 1978 was brought in to require federal judges to file annual financial reports and have a full financial disclosure committee. So the purpose is to expose judges' financial holdings to public scrutiny, which assists the judges in avoiding conflicts of interest. So there is a system in place in the United States. I know I've seen some of the reporting in terms of particular judges. I won't quote it here for the record, but just in terms of the kind of details that are posted. Largely, it includes things like retirement accounts and life insurance policies, and I'm not sure if that really adds any value, but it does potentially open up people to being pilloried in the way that Mr McCaskill says, and having every detail of their financial activities poured over in enormous detail. But when people are investing in a general insurance policy or a pension fund, they don't have any day-to-day involvement in the decisions that are being taken about how that is invested. I'm not sure what relevance it adds to the process. I think there has been one case in Scotland in regards to pecuniary interest, but in that case it was clear that the decision wouldn't have influenced the shareholder value, and therefore it wasn't likely to have had any influence in terms of the pecuniary interest of the judge, him or herself. But I don't know whether colleagues, either Kay or indeed Catherine, have any information of the kind that Mr McCaskill has asked for in terms of negative consequences in the United States.
I don't have any evidence to hand of that, and I think the interesting thing is as well that register only deals with financial holdings in the manner which Mr Wheelhouse has just explained, so there's no personal interest or anything else. It's very narrow, and it is only federal judges. It doesn't go any wider.
Anne McTaggart.
Thanks, Convener, and welcome panel, and welcome the Minister to his new role. Minister, there has been some discussion this morning about the differences, but can I ask you to expand on the differences between, say, perhaps our own role and your role as a Minister? Why you think that would be different, that we have to declare and judges don't? I'm not fully aware, I'm not fully convinced yet that there is an argument there.
I certainly recognise it. Indeed, I suppose to fairly reflect the convener's point as well. I mean, I don't think I don't want to misrepresent the convener in terms of his approach. I'm sure he's entirely above board his intent here, and didn't wish to present anything other than that. But I suppose the concern we have is here two fronts, really. One is that we as MSPs, while we disclose our pecuniary interests and any other things we perceive might be a conflict of interest, there's a lot of trust in us to declare those issues we believe might influence our decision-making as MSPs, our roles, whether they're ministers or committee members or indeed backbenchers, and more generally. And we are trusted to do so, and I believe we have a good record as a parliament in doing this. If there's any degree of criticism of what's in our registers of interest, we have the ability to defend ourselves, and we have the right to do so, and we have the forum to do so as well in Parliament, where we can correct that and put things right on the public record. It is more difficult, I believe. I'm not a member of the judiciary. I have no axe to grind in this particular fight, other than I think that there's an issue of fairness here, and they don't have the same ability to defend themselves in public in the way that we do. That's not to say that there isn't an interest in making sure that everything is above board, and I recognise the points that have been made by the committee. Indeed, as I've alluded to, I will be looking to get feedback from the new JCR, Gillian Thompson, and indeed Lord President himself, whenever I have the chance to meet him, as to what they both think is necessary to try and give confidence, the public confidence that, albeit the system that's largely hidden from view, is operating in a robust way, and that those who are perceived to have a conflict of interest in a case are raising that, are recusing themselves voluntarily, or at least making sure that both parties to a case are aware that there is a risk of a conflict of interest and giving them that choice. I think it's very, very important it's seen to be properly applied and robustly applied, and that there is no subsequent criticism of the kind that Mr Wilson fairly raised, that potentially someone could have a conflict of interest that they were totally unaware of in terms of the judge that oversaw their case, and it may be too late in terms of the appeals process to do anything about it. And we need to get feedback from the Lord President himself and indeed the new JCR as to how they perceive that should be dealt with.
Thank you. MacDonald.
Okay, thanks. Congratulations again on your new appointment and portfolio, Minister. You've perhaps touched on this briefly, but could you perhaps expand on your argument or the Scottish Government's argument that the information on a register could be misleading, as it wouldn't cover all of the potential conflicts that could arise? And do you have a view on the argument that even if a register is incomplete, it could still have value in increasing transparency?
Well, I think obviously we have to pick up as well, just a parallel to Anne McTaggart's point as well, that you know, in the course of a debate, for example, if we believe we've not got something on our or we've got something on our register of interest we want to draw people's attention to, we can do that at the beginning of a debate speech. We can say, you know, presiding officer, bring to your attention my register of interest, and we can flag up that there's a particular concern to make members aware. So we've got the ability to do that on a case-by-case basis. If we're talking about a register that people have to write in advance, it'd be potentially quite difficult to define exactly. You know, if you're dealing with general cases and not a specialist in a judicial sense, it'd be quite difficult to think, you know, every scenario that you could cover, every scenario where there potentially could be a conflict of interest, every potential plaintiff, every potential defendant in a court case that might come forward, and every single interest to declare. So it would have to be entirely comprehensive or targeted. And I think there's a potential that if people haven't at that point anticipated that a case might come forward and they don't put it on the register of interest, it could be misleading. That people might think, oh, there's no conflict of interest there, but actually subsequently they have to add something in advance of a case to make sure that that's clear. So I'm not entirely sure that it would be easy to operate such a publicly facing register and make sure it was fully encompassing of all the potential conflicts of interest that any particular judge or sheriff could find themselves in. But more generally, it's, we've got the example in the US, which, as Kema Crocodile has said, is only really covering the financial aspects. It's not covering the personal relationships or memberships of bodies, which may be an issue. And so it would have to probably be wider than the one in the US to cover all of these potential issues. And it then comes a very difficult thing to manage in terms of, at what point do you decide you know someone sufficiently well enough to put them on a register of interest? You've met someone on the bus. Does that mean you've got to declare an interest that you've had a friendly conversation with them? Or is it somebody you've been a lifelong friend? So it's quite a difficult thing to define, and I certainly welcome committee's view on it, but I don't see the case as compelling at this point myself.
Thanks, Minister. I find it strange that in the American situation, that where it is a requirement to register financial interests, that they don't have to register membership of bodies. That's information that I wasn't aware of.
Well, that appears to be the case. I look to colleagues just to check that. It appears to be the case, Mr MacDonald, that there's no requirement to register memberships, and I do find that slightly odd if the intent is to try and to capture all the potential conflicts. That does seem odd, but in response to that, we have examples in Scotland where people have recused themselves for being members of organisations. So we're one step ahead of the US in that sense. Obviously, Sheriff Cowan recently withdrew from a case voluntarily after having raised the issue with both parties to the case. There was obviously a risk, having been a member of the RSPB, and there were witnesses coming forward who were from the RSPB, that might be perceived to be a conflict of interest rather than an actual conflict of interest. And she gave them the option, and they asked her to recuse herself, and so the system worked well in that case. So we have a system that does appear to work. I appreciate the concerns that we have to be sure it works every time, because one case going through that doesn't work, then that's obviously a concern. But we have no evidence to date that that has happened. So let's look at the glass being half full at this stage.
Okay, thanks. John Wilson, can I cut him off last question?
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. And very interesting debate in relation to the constitutional issue of the United States of America appointment of Supreme Court judges, and I'm sure the Judicial Appointments Board in Scotland will look very carefully at how judges are appointed to the Supreme Court and try and draw in the rules there. But to concentrate on the Register of Interest, Minister, you gave an example in your opening statement that through your experience in your previous ministerial role, that you were aware that senior officials of SEPA were being stalked and harassed by certain elements within the community. I find it really strange in your new role as the Minister for Community Safety and Legal Affairs. Will you be intending to bring forward new legislation which protects public office holders from being harassed and stalked and approached by people involved in criminal activity, to secure the safety of not only the office holders but their families? Because if part of the reason for not having a register is that judges and sheriffs may find themselves being stalked and harassed by certain elements in society, then surely we have to look at the legislation that protects individuals against that type of behaviour.
Well, if I can, Convener, I can give Mr Wilson the assurance that in my previous role we actually brought that forward in the Regulatory Reform Act to protect SEPA officials. That was the reason why those particular measures in that particular Act were brought in protection for SEPA officers, bringing them into line with other key emergency workers in terms of protection. But I take the wider point about the judiciary. Clearly it would be a criminal offence to do what we're describing. But there's a great argument, I think, for prevention rather than a cure. I mean, why create a situation where we're having to create a new protection for judges rather than put them in the position in the first place? If we can avoid giving away sensitive information that might lead them to be coerced in any way, then that's better than having to resolve the situation subsequently through either new legislation or applying existing legislation to do so. I do take the point that Mr Wilson is very fairly making, that the government has a duty to protect people in this situation, and I can assure Mr Wilson that I will do everything in my power to help protect members of the judiciary from being threatened in that way. But I think it's better to prevent rather than have to resolve. But if I can maybe ask Kay McCorkadale if she can give some guidance on what protection there is.
Well, I think that's exactly what the Minister has said. It's a very serious consideration that we will take into account. I just want to go back to the situation with the UK Supreme Court, which was mentioned, and in the context of judicial appointments. Actually, the situation in the UK Supreme Court is that when it was set up, it was decided that it would not be appropriate or indeed feasible for them to have a comprehensive register of interests, because it would be impossible for them to identify all the interests which might conceivably arise. So instead, they have a formal code of conduct, and which is similar to the position that we have in Scotland with the Statement of Judicial Ethics. I just wanted to state that for the record.
I'd like to come back on that point, but I'm not going to cut John Wilson off again. So, Mr Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, you actually said you'd be wary about having sensitive information put on the public record. Could you define sensitive information? Would that be financial information, family relationship information? Because we could potentially have a judge or a sheriff hearing a court case where their son or daughter or their mother or father or an aunt or uncle may actually be appearing before them and defending someone in a case, or representing someone in a case. So what could you define for us today what you mean by sensitive information appearing on a register?
Well, I can give some examples, Convener. I think I would need to get guidance as from justice professionals, the police, as to what might constitute information that could potentially risky in terms of modern technology and the ability to attack or damage the interests of individuals. But certainly information, say, on property, if it was, I think the Convener made a very fair point that potentially, personal households might be kept off any such register. I think that would be a sensible thing to do if there ever did reach a position where there was a register. And that's an appropriate thing to do in that circumstance, to protect the safety of the individual and their family, and that they can have their residence kept private, and therefore not be perhaps a honeypot for those who might want to coerce them in advance of a decision. Anything else, I guess, that threatens the safety or indeed potentially opens them up to coercion in terms of the court case itself, because obviously we want to protect the integrity of the decision-making process in the court, as well as the safety of those actually making the decisions. But just see if there's anything else in terms of examples. Yeah, so yes, it's just been Kay McCorkadale also pointed out that the assets, income and liabilities of judges, spouses and dependent children must all be disclosed, although information may be redacted to protect an individual's safety if it's in danger. This is the situation in the US. So they've obviously had a look at this issue, and that's maybe something worth the committee having an examination of.
Obviously, it seems to me that it's for those who would wish a register to potentially define it. And I'm minded from what John Wilson was saying that there was a recent case in which a judge made a declaration in a high-profile case relating to a football club that he was a season ticket holder at another football club. It would be fair to say, would it be your understanding that that wouldn't have been a financial interest? It wouldn't have been an interest that he would require to give. He didn't recuse himself, but he did publicly make it available. That seemed to me to be the right thing to do, but I just wondered if you had any comments on that generality as to what you would register, because it did seem to me that the judge was correct to make that declaration, and perhaps it's best left to conflict of interest rather than to price rules, because clearly, are we expecting a judge to define or declare if he's a season ticket holder at a football club or a rugby club in a declaration of interest?
I think we have to be, I think Mr McCaskill's absolutely right. We have to be reasonable about this. It's left to MSPs, for example, to judge themselves as to what they believe might constitute or be perceived to constitute a conflict of interest, and therefore to declare things, and voluntarily, if need be. There's a section on the MSP register of interest where we can voluntarily declare things we might, go above and beyond, if you like, what the minimum requirements are. And I'm sure most people, if not all of us, use that facility. And I think we have to rely on the oath, the kind of guidelines which are in place to guide members of the judiciary to consider what things that might be perceived as a conflict of interest or an actual conflict of interest, and to declare those, and leave that to them as to judge themselves as to what they feel is appropriate to declare. And I entirely commend the point that Mr McCaskill's made, that somebody voluntarily made that point, where just so that there could be no perception that there was a conflict of interest, even though that wasn't strictly speaking required under the terms of the recusals policy. You know, obviously we have examples of members of the judiciary behaving entirely appropriately and recusing themselves, or giving the information to allow others to decide whether they should recuse themselves. And I think we should commend that. And I entirely recognise the role of the committee in driving forward, making that a publicly facing register now of recusals, which I think is a very welcome addition to the process, and I commend the committee for achieving that. And I think that will help further drive it, so people can see the kind of examples, and that will inform those involved with future court actions as to what kind of things do constitute a conflict of interest, and help refine the process further.
I'd like to go back to Kay McCorkdale's point about the Supreme Court. You will be well aware, Minister, that prior to the setting up of the Supreme Court, the Scottish Law Lords were members of the House of Lords and had to comply with the Registrar of Interests of the House of Lords. And I'm not suggesting that you've suggested that in some sense a Registrar of Interests is an alien concept to the Scottish legal system. Well, of course it's not. For generations, Law Lords were in the House of Lords and filled in the Registrar of Interests. So the idea that sometimes shock horror we're going to have to fill in the registrar is not in fact shock horror or new at all. This went on for generations. Why did it work well then? Why couldn't it work for judges and sheriffs now?
Well, I think that's a fair comment, Convener. Obviously, the Law Lords did have disclosure under financial interests, and I think perhaps financial pecuniary interests are areas where perhaps there might be perception, the public could perceive there to be a conflict of interest if there's particularly if there's a damages case, perhaps, and a company is being affected by a damages outcome, and there happened to be the judge happened to have shares in that company. Clearly, there would be a conflict of interest there. And so I can understand why, both in the US and in the case of the position the Law Lords had in the House of Lords disclosure rules, that financial interests were declared. What I think the petitioner is asking for is something considerably beyond that, full disclosure of information which might, as I say, in some categories of information might be perceived to put people at risk either of intimidation or intrusive press activity, which would be unhelpful, I think, in maintaining the
petitioner is asking for a register of pecuniary interests.
Okay, well, I mean, there are obviously certain bounds. We've been talked about property assets that you would have to have some safeguards there in relation to personal property, and I recognise that, Convener, you've identified with that already. There are examples, and I take the point on board, and these are kind of things I would have to take forward to the Lord President and the JCR, the new JCR, Gillian Thompson, to get their view on.
I'm conscious of time. I think it was important to continue, and I think, thanks, McDonald, did you have a quick point?
It's just covered the point I was going to raise.
Right. I think the general point I'd just like to say for the record is that I do think, first of all, we have a very high level in terms of quality of the judiciary, and by European and indeed international standards, we are remarkably free of corruption, so I wouldn't want to get any other view than that. However, I do think it's important that for ordinary men and women appearing before judges, that there is an element of transparency, and that's what I think this committee has pursued. And I would put in record my thanks for Lord Gill for agreeing to our request that we do have a register of recusals, which didn't happen before we raised this in April last year.
Welcome that myself, and thank you, Convener.
Mr McCaskill, did you have a final one?
Good to meet with Gillian Thompson. It does seem to me she's come in both at having been at AIB and indeed at Senior Civil Service. Whether she had a view as a fresh pair of eyes, whether that was known to you or whether that information could be provided.
Convener, if I may address that point, I'm not aware yet of Gillian Thompson's view of this, but I will be seeking Gillian Thompson's view on these matters, and happy to invite Gillian Thompson to relay her views on this issue in due course to the committee. John Wilson.
On that note, Convener, the issue I'd like to put on record my thanks to Moy Ali and the evidence that she's given this committee in the past. I'd also like to congratulate her on her comprehensive annual report, which I know was submitted in August and was released last week. And it makes very interesting reading. And I hope the Minister, when he meets with the Lord President, raises some of the issues that have been raised by Moy Ali in her annual report, because clearly she has raised issues about the complaints procedure, the judicial complaints procedure, where she has almost alluded to when a complaint is made against a judge, it disappears into the ether. And there is no transparency in how those issues are dealt with. So it would be useful not only to take on board the new Judicial Complaints Reviewers' view on how they see them taking forward the role of the Judicial Complaints Reviewer, but also taking on board quite clearly the outgoing Judicial Complaints Reviewers' experience over the last 3 years of having to deal with the judicial complaints process and having in particular to deal with complaints that arose in the way that the complaints were dealt with by the Lord President. So hopefully we can move forward and we can get a system that everybody feels confident will take forward the best interests, not just of judges, but the public and everybody involved in the judicial process.
Thank you for that. I'm very conscious of time, Minister. I'm afraid,
just to Mr Wilson.
Briefly.
Thank you, Convener. Just to say that I listened to what Mr Wilson said, and I identify with what he said. I certainly add my own thanks, albeit I wasn't in post at the time Moy Ali was issued. I certainly very much welcome the report, and we will take forward the points that have been raised in the report with Lord President, and indeed to Gillian Thompson as the new JCR. If I could just add that we only formally received the report on the 23rd of October, so the gap is not quite as big as perhaps had been implied.
I would certainly want to back up John Wilson's point. Moy Ali gave excellent and no-holds-barred evidence to us, which is obviously very refreshing and very useful for us. And so I would like to back up the points that Mr Wilson's made. Can I suggest to the committee that we consider this petition again in the new year, at which time we can first of all reflect on today's evidence. We need to look in detail at the annual report of the previous JCR, and we look at the new rules and guidance, which I believe will be published by the Lord President early in the new year. John Wilson?
Yeah, I was going to agree that we look at this again in the new year, but could I suggest we tie into the timing of the release of the information from the Lord President in terms of his new rules, rather than us discussing it as a committee that only to find out the new rules haven't been published. So it would be useful if we could actually tie it in with the new rules being published.
Yeah, I think that's sensible. Kenny McCaskill?
Say that it might be useful to hear from the Minister in due course what they, either through him or directly from the new Judicial Complaints Reviewer, as to what her take in as a fresh pair of eyes.
Good point. Are committee members agreeable? Well, can I thank the Minister and his two colleagues for coming along today. Thanks very much for your evidence. It's been very helpful in working out the committee's next steps, and I appreciate you coming along and giving up your time today. Thank all three of you very much indeed. I'll suspend for 2 minutes to allow our witnesses to change round.